to be honest with you. I had prepared a sermon about 3 weeks ago for today, and then I kind of thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't be speaking on that, maybe I should be speaking on 2 Peter chapter 3. So I then continued to do something on 2 Peter chapter 3, of course, which is all about the destruction of the heavens and the earth. And then this week, I just felt I should go back to the original thing that I was thinking about. And really, we're going to do a study. We won't get through it all before Easter, but we will continue after Easter. We're going to do a study on the book of Joshua. It's going to be impossible to do it line by line, verse by verse. We would be here for a long while if we had to do that. But we're going to pick different sections out of it. And really today, there's really two titles for today. And one is obstacles, and we'll look at that. We'll look at that later. But also you could use the heading, looking back for the future. Looking back for the future. I've got a reading plan for you and for those who are online. If you want to get ahead of the game, as it were, you should see it up on the board, hopefully. It'll come up if I've put the slide up, that's it. Week 1 we'll be looking at Joshua 1 to 3, and then Joshua 4 to 6, Joshua 7 to 9, Joshua 11 to 12, and then 13 to 15, 16 to 18, 19 to 21, and hopefully 22 to 24. And we'll try and get through all of these different chapters. But as I said, if you can take a note of that or memorise it, it will be online, of course, so you can look back on that as well. And you might be able to get ahead of the game and read these. It could take you the whole week to read it, and that's okay. There is a lot of reading in it. But first of all, Joshua 1 to 3, we see when we read this that Israel has reached a place that they had been looking for a long time. For many years they had been looking for this place. And yet the interesting thing in regards to that is, if we look back in the history of Israel, we see people who never saw the promised land. They never saw it coming into fruition. Abraham was promised to be the father of nations, and yet he never really saw any nations being born in that context. And he certainly never saw the promised land. He had a son called Isaac, who had a son called Jacob, who was renamed Israel, who actually became the father of nations. Moses saw the promised land and told the Israelites that they would inhabit it, but he never reached the promised land himself. It was Joshua, who was Moses' assistant, that led the people into the promised land. We actually, if we had to take the time to read Joshua 1 to 3, we would see the book starts on quite a somber note, almost a note of defeat, where the person who freed the Israelites, led them through the wilderness, i.e. Moses, he has died, and I'm sure the Israelites were thinking, we're never going to reach it. Who is going to take up this challenge of leading them into the promised land. If you like, there were obstacles they had to overcome. Many obstacles, actually, they had to overcome. They had lost their leader. A new one was about to be appointed. They found themselves facing the river Jordan. There was also fortified cities that they had to try and overcome. As an onlooker, we would say to reach the promised land was almost impossible, speaking in human terms. The interesting thing is that Moses constantly was called the servant of God. For Joshua, this would have been a huge task, to step into the shoes of someone who is called the servant of God. To try and fill this great leader's shoes could have been a huge task and a huge obstacle, I suppose, in itself. And yet, we read in both the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy that Joshua was spirit-filled and he had hands laid on him by Moses. There is where the power came from. We read that Joshua was given the spirit of leadership. He was empowered to do this task. As I said earlier, he may have been empowered to do this task. He may have hands laid on him and received the Spirit. But that doesn't alter the fact that the obstacles that he was about to face were huge. The first one being the river Jordan. Some of the commentaries that I read said at this time of year, when they were looking at crossing the river Jordan, then it would have been in spate. It would have been higher at that time of year than any other time at all, and really it was almost flooding. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, he came up against the walls of Jericho, a fortified city that had to be conquered. And if you look into the background of it, we used to sing a song when we were in Sunday school. Maybe some of you sung it as well. 12 men went to spying Canaan. 10 were bad, 2 were good. Some saw the giants great and tall, and so it goes on. And there possibly was even giants in this land as well. You see, any one of these obstacles would be impossible to overcome in terms of our own. To try and get across that river that was in spate would almost be impossible. To try and overcome a fortified city again would almost be impossible. Never mind some of the giants that they faced as well would have been impossible. But we see that there are 3 things that helps Joshua ultimately the Israelites to have victory in these seemingly dire situations. The first one is looking back to move forward. And then the second one is, as we've already mentioned, being filled with the Spirit. And lastly was the promises of God. And as we know, God will never, ever, ever break a promise. You see, looking back to move forward, the Israelites, including Joshua, could look back at a time when they saw God moving in a miraculous way. Time and time again, as they were going through the wilderness, they would have saw how God moved and helped them in a miraculous way. Verse 13 tells us, "Remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land," so on, so on. So we see there that they can look back to a time when God promised them a land. Doesn't mean to say they dwell in the past. It doesn't mean to say they dwell looking back, because if they had to do that, then they would trip up. Anybody with any common sense would know that. If you keep looking back and looking back, eventually you're going to fall over. But they could have a glance back at history, as it were, to see how they could move forward. You know, I think on an individual point of view, or even a church's point of view, I don't think it's a bad thing to look back for us to move forward. Just look back and remember what God has done in your life. Look back and remember and think about what God has done in the church's life. And we have seen how he has pulled us through time and time again. And we know that he's going to do that again. It's not a bad thing to look back and remember what God has already done. If we had to look at Hebrews chapter 11, then you would see a whole list of men who had great faith, and of course Moses and that is included in that. A man of great faith. And again, we can see how the Israelites would have realized this. And they would have known that Joshua would have been filled with the Spirit and would be able to carry them through. When I was thinking about this, Joshua being filled with the Spirit, I would imagine he was one of the 72 that shared the power of the Spirit that rested on Moses, as we read in Numbers 11 and 17, where it says, "And I will come down and talk with you there." Isn't that amazing? God himself is coming down to speak with him. I never ever forget, as a teenager, possibly, early teens, maybe a wee bit later, I never forget my mother saying, "What were you up to last night?" And of course I would come away with this amazing story, and it was a bunch of lies, again, really, basically. And she would say, "Just remember, if God had to come back tonight and find you in these places, what would he think?" And that shocked me. It really did. If God had to come back, if God had to come down during the week, or the weekends, and find you in these places, what would he be thinking? Only you can answer that. But he came down. And then it goes on to say, I will take some of the Spirit that is on you and put it on them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone. It's true saying, a burden shared is a burden halved in one sense. If we can help to carry other people's burdens, then that is an amazing thing. The Spirit empowered and gave the people strength, which it also can and does help us to overcome situations. It helped the Israelites to overcome difficult situations. And if we receive that same Spirit and rest on it and lean on it and trust on it, then it will help us to overcome difficult situations. Then we come to the encouraging words of the Father. That is God himself. In verses 5 to 7. These are amazing words. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous. And then it goes on, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to the fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. No man shall be able to stand before you. What a promise, eh? In other words, nothing is going to come and defeat you. You know, this morning, if we grab hold of that alone, that is an amazing thing to think about it. How many commanders of an army would love to hear these words? Think of the confidence, the assurance that this would bring them in the face of a battle. No man will be able to stand before you. Joshua may well have been a bit apprehensive. He may have been a bit scared about taking on this role. But I'm sure when he heard those words, no man will stand before you. This gave him immense encouragement. And then we see it goes on to say, looking back to move forward, just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. You know, we can look back in history ourselves. We can look back in our own lives and remember what God has done and the way that he has carried us through different situations, helped us to overcome lots and lots of obstacles. We can look back and read in history how he has helped great fathers of the faith. And it's the same God then as it is now. No watered down, no weaker, exact same God. And if he helped Moses, and he helped Joshua, and he helped Peter, Paul, and so the list can go on, surely he can help us here this morning. No matter where Moses was, whether it was up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, or whether it was standing by the burning bush, or whether it was in a river, in a basket, whether in the wilderness, no matter where he was, God was there beside him. Yes, he may have been in that elated place, speaking with God one-to-one, up that mountain receiving the 10 Commandments, or as a child thrown into a basket and set loose on a raging river. God was still with him, even then. Some of the times in the wilderness, God was with him. And he is the same with you this morning. He is there with you. And as the psalmist also reminds us, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. As we sung earlier, victory is assured, not because Joshua was a great leader or because Israel was a great nation, but because God is a great God. That is why victory is assured. And then we come, which we've spoken about many times before, and we're not going to dwell on it. But the other part of that verse, I will never leave you or forsake you. And how true those words are. Sometimes we may feel it, and we've got to be honest. Sometimes we may think God has abandoned us, but he never is. He's always there. And I love this last wee part of this verse. Be strong and courageous. God has given us the ability. All we need to do is put it into practice. These are clear commands, not subtle suggestions. This imperative which God issues to Joshua is a call to courageous, obedient leadership. This morning, in whatever situation we might find ourselves in, God is saying, be strong and courageous. And the reason that we can be strong and courageous is because we know he will never leave us. He will never abandon us in that battle. And also, look back. I was strong with Moses, and so I will be with you. But also, and I think this is important, Joshua had the Ark of the Covenant in front of him. Joshua, if you want, had God's presence in front of him, especially when he was ready to cross the Jordan. He knew that God was there with him. And I just want to pick up on one thing, because I think this is absolutely brilliant. Sometimes we think that we need to see God working first before we make a move. Or maybe you're different from me, but certainly a lot of times I need to see God moving first before I make a move. But we read in chapter 3, verse 8b, it says there, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. Remember, this is a raging river. And basically, God is saying to Joshua, listen, mate, you've got to get your feet wet first before you see me making a move. I think sometimes God waits to see a bit of faith. And once he sees that we can put our trust in him, once he sees that we can put our faith in him, then he'll make a way. But Joshua and possibly others had to stand in the river first. And once he stood in the river, then we see the miracle happening. Then the waters part, and they're able to walk through that raging sea, that raging river, on dry ground. I think we need to be strong and courageous, and we need to put our feet in the water first. Then God will make a way. He walked through on dry ground. And I just want, lastly, really, to look at a remarkable woman in this book of Joshua. In chapter 2, we have an interesting person. Many different commentaries have got many different viewpoints on this as well. But we see possibly someone who is a prostitute and really not part of God's people, far from it possibly. And yet we see that she gets a whole chapter to herself. So in my book, if someone is getting that, then we need to take note. We need to sit up and take note. She plays a very important part in this whole narrative. I'm not sure what you think about her, but she must have been seen as important because she also is mentioned in the book of Hebrews. Along with the great men of faith, we see this lady mentioned there as well. And in James 2 and 25, she's mentioned also, where it says that she was justified. We're speaking about that word just and justified on Tuesday, and I always think about that word as it was explained to me years ago. And it was explained this way: just as if I had never sinned, is what justified means. But actually, it goes further than that. Because we actually see in Matthew 1 that she's mentioned as part of the Lord's lineage. As part of the Lord's family history, we see this woman mentioned. Yes, she would have been a prostitute. Yes, she would have done everything that encompasses. And yet, she was saved. You know, I think that is so amazing. That God's love can reach everyone, no matter where we are in society, no matter if we sit in the King's Palace, no matter if we sit aside the curb on the street. God's love reaches everybody. All he's asking us to do is ask for his forgiveness. when reading the story in regards to this lady, one thing that I noticed was that her heart melted. She may have had a hard heart prior to this, but when coming close to God, when encountering a man of God or men of God, and when they spoke to her, when she witnessed what had happened, looking back again, her heart melted. And that's what God does. Doesn't matter how hard their heart is, he can soften that heart. And we believe that. And we've seen it happening as well. We see that Rahab and her household was saved. And I think it's amazing, actually, just to hurry up, hear the kids coming in. But the way that she was saved was by hanging a red rope or a red ribbon from her window. And when I was thinking about that, my mind went to the blood that ran from that cross. The way that Rahab, this terrible woman, was saved was the men who attacked that fortified city and eventually overcame it, saw that red rope, and they knew to keep the occupants of that household safe. In other words, to save the occupants of that household. The way that we can get saved is by looking at that blood that was shed on Calvary for us. And we come to Jesus just as we are. We don't need to be something special. We don't need to be a saint. We just come as we are to Christ. We come as we are to that cross of Christ. And his blood will wash us of every stain. And we will be saved. And then we can go on and be strong and courageous. Just like Joshua and the Israelites were. They overcame great obstacles. I wonder this morning if you've got an obstacle in your life. If you've got a giant in your life and you think, you know what, that's way too big for me to get over. You know, with God on your side, you can overcome it. And again, in this church, we have seen many people overcoming many obstacles. And the interesting thing about that, and I'm going to close honest, but the interesting thing about that is that they overcame the Jordan, and then they were faced with another obstacle. You'd be thinking, we've done well there to get across the Jordan. Surely God's going to let us go free this time. No, they came in front of another obstacle. And they had to overcome that one as well. That's a bit like life, isn't it? Really a bit like life. We might overcome the first one, and then we think, jeepers, man, another one. But we need to have trust in God, and we need to be strong and courageous in every obstacle that comes our way. If you ask a 90-metre or 100-metre hurdle jumper, would they just like to have one hurdle to jump? Yeah, that'd be great. But time and time again, they've got another one to go over, they've another one to go over, they've another one to win that prize. We're not saying it's easy, but what we are saying is we've got somebody by our side who'll help us to overcome. And we need to give God thanks for that. And keep trusting in him. Keep having faith in him. And keep being strong and courageous. We're going to sing our final hymn. And it's really, the whole song is about that. It's called Another in the Fire. And of course that's referring to the fiery furnace, where they 3 men were in the fire, but when the king looked in, he saw 4, because Jesus was there with them in the fire. And this morning, Christ can be with you in the storm and in the fire. So again, we'll stand to